Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Thatcher Bailey. I'm a member of the Town Hall Board, so I get to introduce the guests tonight and to welcome you to Town Hall. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight with Richard Hartlage and guests Sandy Fischer, Shannon Nichol, Randy Allworth, and Kevin Kudo-King. This evening's program is presented by Town Hall in partnership with Land Morphology and Peter Miller Books out there as part of the Arts and Culture series. Support for this series is provided by For Culture, Arts Fund, Arts Washington, and Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. Media sponsorship comes from KUOW and City Arts. After the discussion tonight, which will last about 45 minutes, there'll be a Q&A period, and I ask you to come and use the microphones here so everybody can hear you. And also because we're recording this evening, and it will be available, so it can be available on the Town Hall website for you and others to listen to in the weeks ahead. And after the presentation, Richard will sign copies of his book over there at the Peter Miller table, and the cafe will stay open too, so you can stay around, grab a drink, and have a conversation. I need to pitch a little bit about what's coming up at Town Hall because this is an amazing organization and lots is coming up. So I wanted to tell you about some arts and culture events that might whet your appetite. November 20th, which I think is Friday, the editor-in-chief of Sierra Magazine, Jason Mark, comes here to talk about the accessibility of truly wild places and our duty to protect those places. Also on the 20th of November, New Zealand a cappella group Weary to Aka presents an evening Maori performance that will cross language barriers and speak to your soul. I didn't write that sentence, but I'm sure it's true. On November 23rd, famed endurance swimmer Diana Nyad will share insights from her new book, Find a Way, about how to do, insane things at any age. Add to that an evening with Patti Smith on the 22nd, Seattle Radio Theater's live taping of Miracle on 34th Street on December 4th, and you get just a taste of what's up at Town Hall over the next couple of weeks. And the best way to keep up with events at Town Hall is to become a member of Town Hall. Memberships cost as little as $45 and as much as you want after that. They offer down front seating, both downstairs and upstairs is one of the benefits, and you get discounted ticket purchases, you get discounted books, mailed a copy of the calendar, and most importantly, your membership is what makes ticket prices so low that Town Hall events are accessible to just about everybody. So if you already are a Town Hall member, thank you for making this place the community gathering place that it is. And if you're not, there's a membership opportunity right after the performance, and you can also buy tickets, seasonal and otherwise, at the same table. And now on to tonight's guests. Richard Hartlage over there, founding partner and CEO of Land Morphology. His innovative designs are renowned as emotive, immersive spaces that incorporate sophisticated horticulture, artful detailing, and historical knowledge that heighten our experience of the natural world. I didn't write that either, but it's true, and I think everyone here probably knows that. A couple of summers ago, I was at a big fancy party on Lake Washington and was kind of down at the lake looking up at this house that was the opposite of immersive, a big mansion kind of hulking out over the lake. But I was looking across this amazing garden meadow kind of up this hill, and it just kind of seduced me into it, and what seemed like a simple planning became incredibly complex, and it got deeper and deeper into it. And I looked back up at the house and I realized it had kind of softened the crazy scale and feel of the house, and it all worked together in this way that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So that sentence is true, the work is amazing, and we're lucky to have Richard in Seattle. As an avid writer and teacher, Richard has given hundreds of lectures worldwide, and his writings have been featured in the New York Times, Architectural Digest, Metropolitan Home, Fine Gardening, and the Seattle Times, not surprisingly. Many other publications across the United States, Japan, and Europe. He has also contributed to 5 books on horticulture and design, including his latest, Bold Visions for the Garden, which is the topic of the discussion tonight, and which will be available after the talk to my right. Richard's joined tonight by a very distinguished panel of some of Seattle's most noted architects, including Shannon Nichol, a founding partner of Gustafson Guthrie Nichol, Randy Allworth, founder of Allworth Design, and Kevin Kudo-King, a principal and owner of Olson Kundig. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Richard Hartlage, Shannon Nichol, Randy Allworth, and Kevin Kudo-King. Thank you.
Yeah, what Thatcher didn't tell you was $1,000 to look at that garden that day. it was a benefit for President Obama in the re-election campaign. So it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. We wanted to do something different rather than just have a lecture about the new book. So there's some thank yous in order first. First to Sandy Fischer, my business partner. This was a book that I wanted to write a long time, and the two of us did this together, and it was quite extraordinary. A good friend of mine who's written many books says, writing a book is really like 2 years of constipation. We did it in 9 months. So, and then all my coworkers from Land Morphology, and the unfortunate thing is our editor from Monticelli Press is Stacy Graville Lawrence, is homesick with her children, and she didn't want to contaminate you all. And then some of the architects that we work with in the office, we've of course done work with Kevin and Olson Kundig, and most particularly with Stuart Silk and Mike Troyer, who are both here tonight as well. So I am a big advocate of history, and this is a very quick run through, so buckle your seatbelts. And it's funny, when we started this book, I think that there's very little that's new in the world of design. It's all kind of variations on a theme and understanding really clearly where things start. And so as a horticulture and landscape architecture student, I think 150 years ago, if you've never read Gertrude Jekyll, it's fantastic for putting you to sleep. But it still is a style of planting that, in the process of doing the book, is still very, very relevant. And so it was really kind of extraordinary to go out and be invited into our colleagues' projects and all around the country and see how they were interpreting a broad selection of things. There were some high points to the experience, and this was certainly one of them. This is Herr Schaut in Chicago, Illinois, and they're a 40-person firm whose work I've admired in publications, and so I had the opportunity to see half a dozen projects and photograph 2 of them. And it was extraordinary to me to see how relevant their work was and how they practiced in an incredibly broad range of styles, because there are 2 kinds of design firms, those that have a signature style and you go and you hire them for that, and then those that can practice across a diversity of viewpoints. And they certainly could do that. It was really quite extraordinary. So, you know, hearkening back to good old Gertrude and William Robinson and the plantings of this, but the incorporation of modern materials was really quite extraordinary. So one of the great joys of doing this book was searching out people who I both admired and new voices in landscape architecture and garden design, and then also looking for excellent projects. And excellent projects were strong design, beautiful framework, a craftsman use of materials, and then great projects. So you can see here again, Herr Schaut on the 20th floor of 800 Michigan Avenue with a totally different Mondrian block planting style, and how they interpret it. It was just really quite extraordinary. Doug Hare made his reputation in Chicago by being invited by Mayor Daley to do the annual plantings along Michigan Avenue, which they've now been doing for almost 20 years. And so that was another extraordinary thing, because landscape architecture and horticulture diverged after World War II, and it's coming back together now. And this panel here represents that, And there are more than 20 firms and single owner visitors in the book that represent that. And so, you know, the first part of my career was in public horticulture, and so it's really fun for me to see that because I value both. We really thought we were going to find a whole series of really incredibly new voices. And what we really found was mid and late career firms who were re-embracing plants and a much more integrated expression of building spaces. And so, you know, Olin Partners is based in Philadelphia. They're about a 100-person firm. And if you would have told me 10 years ago that they could do great planting design, I would have told you they were full of shit, basically. But, but they're doing it now, and that's really extraordinary. This is the New Barnes Foundation. So incredibly artful, sculptural detailing in the landscape. But the firms are either using ecologists or trained horticulturists, and many of them are hiring in horticulturists to work within their firms now. Two of the really most important public gardens in the United States that have really changed the nature of how we perceive public landscapes are first the High Line, led by James Corner. It's the #1 tourist attraction in New York, which is quite extraordinary. It's really nothing more than a stroll garden with superb detailing and amazing plants. And secondly, and I've seen it many times, is Millennium Park and the Lauri Garden, which Shannon and her firm won that competition for. And the reason that they're game changers is because they're modern designs, incredibly beautiful detailing, very innovative expressions of what a landscape can be, and a full embrace of nature and urban settings. And so it's extraordinary because we also work on botanic gardens, and it's changing the entire discussion of what's going on in public gardens in America today. Because public gardens used to be these odd places where people would go and look at plants, and now they're becoming a full expression of cultural institutions. And so that's really exciting. And this is Shannon's work at the Gates Foundation. And the other thing that's beginning to happen now is this pursuit of sustainability. But one of the things that I can't stand as a design professional is sustainability is more than a planted ditch. And they certainly show that what is possible here. And so one of my great and amazing people that I look up to, and I was fortunate enough to meet him before he died, was Roberto Burle Marx. And so he really was a Cubist painter working in landscape. And so it's extraordinary to me how an idea emerges and then people pick it up and develop a riff on it. And I think what really began to bring planting design and great form back into landscape architecture in the United States is the work of Omi van Sweden, based in Washington, D.C. This is the Federal Reserve building. It's been recently redone by Lisa Del Plas, who's the managing partner there. And so we were just talking about how firms transition before the thing starts. Many firms fall short in the second generation. They lose their vitality. And Omi van Sweden has not lost its vitality. They've managed to recreate themselves in very powerful, relevant ways. But they still embrace the tradition of, a German's horticulture background, Wolfgang Omi, and Jim's training in architecture and arts. And this project opened up the world of landscape architecture in the United States, I think. And how their voices changed over the years. This is the new native plant garden at the New York Botanic Gardens, and I saw it right after it went in, and I thought, oh my God, I was kind of disappointed in it. I went back 9 months later and was completely blown away. And so that's the other thing about what we do as garden makers and landscape architects is, the day our projects start is the day the bulldozers pull off the site. And I think we forget that, and particularly with young professionals, it's not the drawing set that is the product. It is the final experience of place. And so that was really extraordinary. And, you know, this is Randy's work here in Seattle. Again, playing with these Mondrian-like block style of planting, but in a really beautiful way. 80% of our firm is residential. We do some commercial and some public work, and all of Randy's firm is residential. And so the advantage to that is we work with really crazy people, but they build very artfully and very fast. And so, you know, it's really extraordinary to use the best materials in the most extraordinary ways on exceptionally beautiful sites. And I think this work really exemplifies that. And so it's, you know, looking at how things are moving is really quite extraordinary. I think in terms of design professions, both in landscape architecture and architecture, so often the residential work gets looked a little bit down on because the public work benefits the public good. But we were talking, and like if we work on 6 private residences on Lake Washington and restore 6 shorelines, that's as much as a public park. And so that's, you know, always looking through a lens with a set of values, we can direct clients to do great things. One of the emerging firms in the United States and doing extraordinary things is Nelson Bird and Waltz. They're doing the gardens at the center of the biggest development in the country right now, which is Hudson Yards, which is extraordinary to think that the center point of the most expensive development on both coasts is a garden. And so here is their work at City Park in St. Louis. And it's a block style of planting with predominantly native plants, but not exclusively. And like Millennium Park, that's the other extraordinary thing, this was built with private money. And so people are beginning to invest in public spaces. I think with the baby boomers, their backs going out, and single income families becoming a thing of the past, we place a higher value on our urban setting. And it was really incredible to see that. So an incredible collection of art, again, exquisite materials in a very well-crafted and beautifully designed way with an incredible collection of plants. With our own work, we also mix and match the themes and the styles. This is one of the projects that I've been working on now for a good almost 15 years. The client's now beginning to collect art. I think that's one of the emerging themes in landscape architecture and architecture both, is both the incorporation of art through artists and design firms are beginning to cross boundaries. So we get asked all the time, oh, you design art. I don't believe that we design art, because art asks questions and design answers questions. So I say we will often do artful objects, but then how those settings begin to pull together and become a complete experience. This is the first meadow that we did, which was really quite extraordinary. That's 250,000 plugs. And it's easier to do a meadow on the East Coast than it is the West Coast. I'll tell you that much. So, and this is that garden that Thatcher was looking at. And so this is not native plants, but it is a matrix based on the Germans and Karl Forster, which was probably the most seen plant of all the gardens that we photographed, because it grows in Chicago and it grows in Southern California and it grows in the desert. So this German that had a nursery between the 2 world wars took the ideas of Gertrude Jekyll and said, why don't we plant plants from like ecology so they take fewer resources? And that's really spurred an entirely new movement. Cassian Schmidt, he was here in Seattle speaking a few years ago, and I'm dying to go and see his project, because only in Germany would he have a landscape architecture degree, a PhD in plant science, developing an arboretum, and cataloging all the maintenance on this property, and then giving that information away to professional designers. which is really extraordinary. You just have to be able to read German. And I think this is one of the new voices, Adam Woodruff, and he lives in St. Louis and is personal friends with Pete Outoff, and you can see the influence there. It's going to be really, he's very young. He's like 35. He still has hair. No, he's actually bald as a cue ball. But it's going to be really exciting when he finds his own voice, because right now he's very reliant upon the aesthetics that Pete has developed, but he's incredibly talented. The whole idea of meadows, and they are so much in vogue now, but you really have to know what you're doing. Larry Weiner is based in Philadelphia and often collaborates with other landscape architects, and so that's one of the ways that people develop these incredibly intricate planting plans is through collaboration. And so we saw that again and again and again. Larry often collaborates with Nelson Burden Waltz and Rodney Robinson office in Philadelphia, and whole slews of Michael Van Valkenburg's office as well. And so the boundaries of the professions are blurring, and there's more collaboration than there ever has been, and that's really extraordinary. This is quite wonderful. Oh my God, who did the sculpture part? Weissman-Freddy, yeah. So this is a Weissman-Freddy new visitor center at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens with an H.M. White meadow on the roof, which is really quite extraordinary. And then there are rain gardens in the parking lot, which are, again, very beautiful and very artful. He also did the interior courtyards at the New York Times building. So it's just a little bit of where we see things going. What we really want to do is introduce Kevin Kudo-King, who is an owner and partner at Olson Kundig, and we just finished a master plan at Leach Garden, and we asked Kevin to be the moderator tonight because they have a very important firm in Seattle, and he also has worked with all of us. And so he took the time to write first a series of questions that will be unique to each of us, and then we'll open it up to you.
Well, it's true. I've worked with absolutely everybody here, and over the years, one of my first projects was actually with Randy, and they still invited me here. I appreciate that. And you'll have to forgive me. I am an architect. I'm going to ask some naive questions of you guys, and but hopefully you'll give some insightful answers. So, let's start with you, Richard. In your book, you refer, and tonight earlier, you refer to garden makers and landscape architects. And I'm sort of intrigued by the difference between those two and how they would approach design and approach creating a garden.
Well, I think it used to be that the two were held as separate. Landscape architects also, is a legal designation. You have to pass a test. But in the past, garden makers would do predominantly residential gardens, and landscape architects would function as designing public spaces. And that is beginning to change, and Shannon is an example of that. And so we too got lots of public and private commissions in public spaces, and I think that is one of the things that's really exciting about the profession right now, is the kind of recombining of old ideas.
I'll ask the next question of Sandy. Sandy, what are some of the key lessons from the book? Some takeaways?
I think really embracing the diversity of plants and taking some risk and understanding that the horticulture is as important as nature and artifact in shaping the landscape, and in fact the plants are both.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question here of Randy. A pretty straightforward one. Where do you start a project with a client?
That's actually not that straightforward, Kevin, but I'll give it my best shot. Well, our firm, we're all landscape architects, a fairly small office of 6 people, and the way we've really built the company is we primarily all our projects are with architects, and so when we're starting a project, it's not we're not going out to say an existing residence or something like that. We're typically starting at the beginning, where it might be a new house or a renovation of a house, and the landscape's either fully renovated or partly renovated. So our starting point is really as part of a design team, and often there are also interior designers, full layers of engineers and all sorts of things. Often they're brought in later, but we really like to be involved. Ideally, our projects are landscape architect and architect at the beginning. So, and that gives us great opportunities to work together to, initially start forming a program with the client, which is, what is the architectural program, what's the building going to do, and what's the landscape going to do in terms of supplying spaces for activities and things like that. But we also think at the beginning about what's the aesthetic program of the project. So we start to look at imagery together with the architect and with our clients, and so we form this functional and aesthetic vision at the same time before we really start putting pencil to paper and starting creating ideas. And my original major was art, so I love to draw. And so one of the other things I do very early is start to doodle. And so whether it's just me off on the side or getting things ready to show the clients or sharing with the architect, there are wads and wads and wads of trace paper that I go through. I literally have environmental guilt for the paper that I use, so I try and make up for it in the work we do. This approach is a little bit different project to project. We do quite a few projects in the city that are rural, and so the programming is in a more restrained, confined space, and often every square inch of the property is being changed. But we also are starting to do more and more rural work, so very large properties that involve both, high design in some cases with a lot of changes happening, but a lot of very careful soft steps and even restorations and things like that. So our startup is kind of similar between those two types of projects, but with the big rural stuff, we're looking at a lot more ecological things that we're considering too.
I think the first thing you do is make the architect happy.
I agree. Next question's for Shannon, and that's a perfect segue. Richard, thank you. How do you approach the integration of architecture and landscape?
That's a loaded question and a really good one. That was a good segue. Nice work. Integration is an interesting word, especially when we're thinking about the authentic landscape. And our goal, the selfish goal of the landscape architect, just looking at our own work on the ground, is to make a ground plane that feels like it is authentic, like it's this sort of condition that was somehow born of its own story and its own making, and you're looking at it and you walk through it, and it's exciting because it feels like it's sort of living its own story, as opposed to something that was sort of applied in a shallow way by the designer. So we're looking at the history of the site, we're looking at the client, the culture, the context, and thinking what things are kind of bigger than us that could tell us what to do with this site. Then we often have a building that's in design at the same time, and we want to understand what the architect's ambitions are for the building and tell a story about how that building is reacting to the landscape. Even though the landscape isn't there yet, we're designing it. So we're creating this false timeline or this false story of the landscape was here and then the building reacted to it in this way. And that kind of leads into a little bit of I hope it doesn't turn into a rant, but an observation about the last maybe 10 years. We landscape architects are almost, overwhelmed with this luxury we have now of architects that want to collaborate and integrate their architecture with landscape. People are interested in landscape again, they're interested in ecology. And there's something so fundamentally beautiful and not easy, but clear to articulate about a story of there being land and then man comes in and builds something upon it that has a really poetic reaction to it. And when we have architects that want to make their buildings look like our landscape that we haven't designed yet, And they might want to make it look like a 30 or 40 foot tall hill in a landscape that doesn't have any hills around or in the middle of the city. That's a different sort of situation, and it causes these really interesting conversations in our office about authenticity and collaboration, and when is integration a good thing, and when is it almost a complication in trying to tell that story about architecture and landscape.
Yeah, one of the things that was really important to us when we were forming the book, and it's such an overused word, when it's not used from the heart, and Shannon just used it several times, is authenticity. And it's one of the things that we really value. And I agree with you. It is becoming an embarrassment of riches because landscape architecture is, for so many years, was seen as a stepchild, and now these projects emerge simultaneously. And that process is really extraordinary. And that's when you get an authentic project.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question here of noted, Shannon. Yes.
Sorry.
I mean, it's an interesting thing because we just worked on the Leach Botanical Garden, and here was a project where we started at the same time, and we were really looking to you for what to respond to. And I think you guys were looking to us as well, and we were both looking at the client and the story of the site. So it really was, it was very fast-paced, series of charrettes, and it was where we got to was quite exciting. But
sometimes that can create magic when everyone's blank slate is there at the same time, and you have this combined story that you're making out of the land. That's absolutely true.
Well, and that's what we just did with Kevin, because we really didn't get a lot of direction from the client themselves at Leach. And we kind of spent several months groping, so trying to draw them out, and then we finally realized, well, it's really hard. Because they didn't know what they wanted. And then, and then we would do something and Kevin would respond, and then Kevin would take the lead and we would respond to that, and it ended up being this really quite extraordinary plan. So.
How often have you been able to start with a blank slate, and how important is it? I'm off script now, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I would say it's rare that it's that blank. We have a client right now that pretty much has told us, and they've hired an architect and said, we don't really know what we want to do. We have this great piece of property, so why don't you tell us? And I was just thinking as you were talking, what's harder, the client that gives you almost no input, or the client that is so already set about what they want? And I think those are both challenging, but I actually think I'd prefer the blank slate over the one that has a lot of preconceived notions about what their property should be like.
The blank slate is terrifying, and it might be one of the reasons why we really dive into researching the history of the site and almost kind of making up this geology, this set of, we sort of think of them as almost these natural rules of how things happen on the site, what things tend to be layered on top of the other, what kind of oscillation in the land movement feels like it's appropriate and could have actually evolved in place in the site, and what seems out of place. So you make up these rules based on facts that are indisputable and bigger than you and interesting. And sometimes that can help a client gain a sense of right and wrong and opinion about their site, because they learn more about the site and they get that sense of what's appropriate or what would be a wasted opportunity if you didn't highlight it and sort of bring it back into being visible on the site.
Yeah, I want Sandy to say something. So when we joined forces 3 years ago, our point of conflict is because I was in professional gardening, I look at a garden and a landscape as being changed on a daily basis and incrementally over time. And Sandy is also trained as a planner. And so she immediately goes to the biggest possible picture and then works her way down to the detail.
Right, and he can start with a detail, like, this is the detail that's gonna fit onto the site, and it's like, how do you know that? How do you know? And, but I think the other thing that is fun about that is coming from two different backgrounds in training and the kind of dialogue that we can have on projects or a book. And it made me really much more aware of how I was educated as a landscape architect, sort of rules that you're given from day one, like right plant for the right place, don't clip and prune, and then you see these beautiful sculpted clipped, and you think, well, or a green wall, which is coming in vogue now, so people, since we're all about green, now it's okay to clip the hedges and build the green walls, but it used to not be. Or I think I was educated to use all natives, but that's not true, because they don't, I mean, think about the natives in Seattle, Pacific Northwest, they don't necessarily work in an urban setting, and after about a year of working with him, I kind of wrote down all the kind of rules that he breaks that I didn't actually know.
That's your next book.
Pieces of it found its way into this. But I think like I've just been to some of the sites, and you see that in Pete Olorf's Humella Garden with the sculpted hedges, but I've just seen the variety of ways that plant can be used, the different typologies, and I think that's what we tried to bring out in the book is there are so many different styles, they are rooted in history, and there are historic precedences and ways that they have evolved, and that's really kind of how we set the chapters up, is what's the style, who started it, how has it changed, who's the current practitioners. But like Richard said, we thought we would find certain people practicing in certain niches, but the really good firms move across all of those.
So in architecture, and in particular the work that we do, we tend to refer to ourselves as regionalist, and even though we do work all over the world, we're always looking for a context there to respond to. The blank slate scares us as well. But with landscape architecture and gardens, it seems like there's this ability, this wonderful opportunity to have plants that come from everywhere, and especially in a botanical garden where it's this about the education as well as the beauty. And so, Richard, can you just talk a little bit about if you do a garden on the East Coast versus the West Coast, what's the difference in your approach?
Well, I'd like Shannon to answer this too. But for us, whether we're using natives or exotics, we want them to feel of the place. And one of my own personal pet peeves, particularly of less nuanced professionals, is over evergreened landscapes because it's the seasonal change that is so exquisitely beautiful. And you do it too. You work all over the United States and abroad as well. And so how do you find the right mix of first materials and then a framework so that it feels comfortable in the place, and then what details are built up to support the story, which is what you said. And that's really what we're doing, is we're telling stories.
Yeah, I mean, I really could hardly say it better than that. I mean, what is joyous and healthy feeling about any landscape is that it's a product of a unique place that's more complex than anything you could have imagined before you get there, and it's sort of teaching you something, and it has its own its own information about the nuances in that location, and how boring and sterile things would be if everywhere we went we saw the same plants, or there was no relationship between the plants and the climate and the culture and the soils. And we're, as much as we talk about these projects where people hire landscape architects, we are in danger, I think, still of losing a sense of regionalism and losing a sense of reinforcement in our daily lives. Most of the landscapes we don't talk about in panels like this. We have you know, Norway maples planted on, and purple leaf plums planted on most of our streets in Seattle. And not to knock those, I know that they're, you know, really durable street trees, but life is better when the details that you look at teach you something about place and nature, and that comes from regional selections.
I don't really think that you ever have a blank slate in landscape, because you always start with the three-dimensional form, and then you kind of explore what is the spirit of the place. But the larger landscape, the horizon, the views, the topography, the hydrology, what will grow there. So I guess I don't feel like landscape architects really start with a blank slate. You can start with a confused client, which is maybe a blank slate. I mean, we do get asked to do some pretty silly things sometimes.
Randy, is that what you look for in a client? The opportunities that come from confusion?
Well, not exactly. I prefer the sophisticated client that says that has very great taste, but they don't give you too many constraints. So actually, one of my best ones was one that we did with Jim Olson a long time ago. A couple of courtyards in Madison Park. I won't mention the client's name in public, but she said to me the very first day, she said, we have these spaces. They had been there since the 70s. It was an old Roland Terry house, and it was being remodeled. And she just said, I don't want to tell you what to do. I just want you to do what's appropriate. And it was like angels were singing in the background. And the project turned out fantastic, and it was published in several magazines, and they loved it, and it was just a great experience all the way through. So.
Wonderful. So Shannon, I want to ask you a question about, you guys do amazing work, as all of you do, and perhaps this is a question for everybody. How do you assure that the work evolves, and how do you maintain the level of high design and quality and passion, but having it change over time?
Well, our answer to that would trace back, hopefully not boringly, to the last conversation we were just having, which is that specific reaction, the new reaction to each place and site and client that we have. I think that we are aware of trends and what our collective eyes are hungry for. There's been a hunger for texture and informality and a sense of authenticity, which is, you know, subjective. That we've seen that in interiors, we've seen it, now it's almost starting to ease back. But we always use different decades that have already gone past and have already proven themselves as examples. We kind of went from mid-century modern to kind of the 70s and early 80s in interiors, and we've been sort of doing the same thing in landscape, the Victorian farmhouse in the meadow and the field, and a fascination with Victorian design. So we're aware of all those things, and we talk about that stuff. I think it would be disingenuous if I didn't say we were aware of trends, but we really do want to have that same sense of uncertainty when we start every project about where we're going to go with it, what we're going to learn about the site, what we're going to learn about the client, and what story we're making up, sometimes with an architect involved and then sometimes not. And then what do we have to do plant-wise to pull that off? And on the Gates Foundation, we were trying to pull off the illusion of this sort of like boggy ground, this boggy mat of blueberry-like foliage in places where we couldn't grow, you know, we could grow blueberries in some areas. We have 2 varieties of them that are massed together at the entry there. But there are other areas where we didn't have enough sun, or we were looking at sort of companion plants that you'd see in a blueberry like bog in our area. And we went to non-native plants. We tried plant combinations we never would have tried otherwise, just straining to sort of pull off this cohesive landscape that wasn't necessarily trying to emulate a precise natural landscape, but was trying to pull off this kind of experience. And I guess every project we usually have to do something really weird with plants to try to pull off the story.
I agree, and I think one of the extraordinary things about flying around, because I photographed 30% of the book myself, was to see how people with older and established firms were keeping their voices relevant, and you really summed it up, texture and variety. And one of the things that Kevin and we talked about a lot when we were designing Leech is this, the idea of beautifully crafted objects and built forms, that really demonstrate not just through the point of view of the designers, because, we can design this stuff, but then to get out in the field and work with such talented people who still are working with their hands and can execute a vision and bring something to the table is just extraordinary. I mean, I always say one of the best days in my office is a day in the field, which gets to be fewer and fewer. Yeah.
One of the things that was really notable to me of starting to work with Richard too was how long he was involved in with his clients. A lot of my work has been sort of, you design it, you bid it, you build it, you close it out. Hopefully they invite you back or you go back. Where coming from a gardening background, it's just expected that every season you'll show up, you'll look at what you might add, what might change, you put bulbs in, train the gardeners. So building a landscape and building a garden, cultivating a garden, you build a landscape, you kind of cultivate a garden, and I think there is a difference, back to your first question about a garden maker versus.
And I know that that's true of Randy and Shannon as well. The ethos is changing, and how often do you go back to see the Lauri garden and walk it with the gardeners? And
Not as often as we wish.
but
It's
I bet not at all, though, which would have been the old paradigm.
Yeah, no, it's true. It depends on the client. The Gates Foundation, not just because it's local, but it's a client that is very collaborative, and they have a problem-solving culture. We get brought back into all sorts of discussions about management and learning about how different paving materials and details are performing. And then there's some projects where, we hope to be brought back in, but maybe the facility manager has changed, or there's a new mayor, or a new agency has taken over the project, and we can never find our way back in.
Well, the nature of how public projects are funded too. I mean, it's a capital project, it's got a fund, it's built, it's done. Whereas a private client, if they're engaged and invested, you don't have that whole consultant selection process, you don't have the annual capital improvement budgeting. So I think there's just a big difference just in the structure.
We've actually, this has been a subject that we've talked about at our office because we tend to get very busy, and we're on to the next project, and you might not see a project for 3 or 4 years, and sometimes you come back and it's fantastic and it's the greatest surprise to see that change, and other times it's semi-horrifying because the landscape maintenance person is not up to snuff or what have you. And so we've actually just recently started turning into a new sort of side wing of our business where we are offering our clients toward the end of a project, we talk to them about an annual maintenance meeting or just a check-in. And so most of those are in the spring when plants are coming out of winter and you're starting to see how things are doing and what's working and what's not. And our clients have been overwhelmingly receptive to the point now I'm worried that I'm going to have too many of those, and I'm going to have to actually staff a whole separate office just to go out and revisit old projects. But it's turned into a great opportunity to keep working on them as they mature, fixing the things that you thought might work that didn't quite work, or the client has a change in their family or whatever, and it requires a redesign of a certain part of the project. So it's turned into this actual revenue generating thing for us too. But most of all, it's just the satisfaction of now sort of, these are our babies and we get to kind of make sure they grow up and head off into the world properly. So
We've had clients that have really fallen in love with a certain plant in the garden, and then they'll actually start watching the way it interacts with the other plants we have it massed with, and we'll sort of get mad at a plant that might be competing too much with a plant they like more. And that happens actually fairly frequently, and then we'll come back in and you know, tame the other plant or put another plant that's less aggressive and put more of their favorite plant in that they have been watching duke it out and feel like it needs a boost.
It's interesting to me as an architect.
The bricks don't duke it out, do
that
they?
you go back to your projects looking for change and seeing how they.
Praying for
if
it.
we come back and they've changed, we've usually done something wrong. So it's kind of interesting. We probably want to open it up for questions. Is this a good time, or?
If there are, there probably aren't any.
I have a question. So you guys, there's kind of a love fest going on up here between architects, landscape architects, garden makers, and yet that can't always be the case. And can you describe sometimes when you come into a built situation that's just hard to imagine how you will recuperate it or work with it, and what do? I mean, how do you walk away? What happens? Or does that ever happen?
Well, yeah. First, I know these two well, and I admire their work, and I know that they function in a similar way to I do, but you can answer it for yourself. We don't take every client. I mean, none of us are commodity-based firms, and nor is Kevin as an architect. And so there are times when you have to walk away from a project. So, I mean, then there are other times when you just dig in and figure it out.
I thought I'd already had a little bit of a dark cloud when I talked about the overly eager integration with landscape forms where we don't end up with a building, we have this weird lump in our landscape. That would be one. That's really challenging because it's goodwill on all sides, and then your landscape is being sort of subverted and taken away on this behavioral diversion that it normally wouldn't. I think one of the hard situations that we've had is when we come into a project and there's already pretty major kind of skeletal structure drawn for the landscape, and it might be you know, that I guess you could say it might feel a little overly prescriptive, and we usually just gauge the vibe. Is this coming from the client? Is it coming from the architect? Is it because we weren't here yet? We actually like having something to react to, and then you have that initial conversation and you can get a sense of whether, well, this is here because we wanted to have a grand procession that leads you toward the entry, and you know, if we can understand what the intention is, like why are those lines there, or why were those hills there, or the berms, or whatever, you know, is preceding us, we'll, you can tell I love berms and little hills. Then we'll say, well, let's figure out what this building wants. What experience are people supposed to have when they get the first impression of the building and as they approach it? And if we can come up with something that seems like it's fulfilling that need and there's a receptiveness, then, you know, often something that starts out and seems totally prescriptive and full of, you know, there's arcs all over the paper or whatever, will end up being some of our best collaborations we've ever had. It's just a matter of listening.
I want to throw the architects under the bus. With the first, particularly on a public project and a commercial project, very often the first stab at a site is a civil engineer, and that's real fun.
Might as well throw everybody under the bus.
Well, because they're problem solvers.